It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, but I do want to start with some housekeeping. And one is, if you want AIA continuing education credit for this lecture, you should go into the chat box and write your name and AIA, and then we'll collect that at the end of the lecture and get that to you. Also, the upcoming architecture lectures are actually also two in this series. Eric Mumford is lecturing on December 3rd, and then Chantal Blakely is lecturing on December 7th. And they are also, like Bob Kahn this evening, they are lecturing on work of a particular modern architect of their choosing. It's my pleasure to introduce Bob, if I can find my notes. Okay. So Robert Kahn is a practicing architect based in New York City. He received his bachelor degree from Washington University and his master's degree from Yale University. Prior to starting his own firm in 1986, he worked for James Stirling and Michael Wilford in London. And he was the senior designer for the Performing Arts Center at Cornell University, one of their better known American works. Robert Kahn's clients include many from the performing arts, his practicing clients, or the clients in his practice, including the artist Frank Stella, director Wes Anderson, actors Daniel Day-Lewis, Kevin Kline, Mary Louise Parker, and Billy Crudup, and playwright David Manet. In addition to his own work, Kahn has collaborated on numerous projects actually with the artist Frank Stella, who I think we'll hear something about tonight as well. Robert Kahn is a fellow of the American Academy in Rome, and he's received design awards from the American Institute of Architects and the New York City Times Design, among others. He was honored with the Distinguished Alumnus Award from Washington University in St. Louis, shortly after I came here, I believe, if I recall, and the Glassman Prize for Design Excellence and the Alumni Award, both of those from Yale University. Kahn's work has been published in Architectural Digest, the New York Times Magazine, New York Times, Interior Design, among others, and in a number of books. In addition to his practice, Kahn is also a creator and editor of the remarkable City Secrets guidebooks, including City Secrets Manhattan, City Secrets London, City Secrets Florence and Venice, City Secrets Paris, and City Secrets Rome, to which I had the honor of contributing, as well as City Secrets movies and City Secrets books. And I would say that once travel again becomes possible, I highly recommend consulting these remarkable guides, because they give you a real insider's sense, because most of the writers have lived in these cities for a number of years and are often architects and artists. Also, in addition to his practice, Kahn has taught design studios at Columbia University, Ohio State University, and Yale University, where he held the Davenport Chair professorship. He recently taught a history and theory seminar at Washington University that was entitled Hidden in Plain Sight, How to Read a Building. I sat in on this, one of these seminar sessions when he was teaching, and I understood that the larger lesson that was to be imparted in the class has to do first with being there and looking long and looking hard. The longer you look, the more and deeper you see. It can be argued that being there and looking long and hard are really the most appropriate forms of primary research for the architect. The second lesson that Kahn's seminar teaches is that we learn most effectively from the work of other architects, and that the constructively critical relation between generations of architects makes possible the continuity of fundamental ordering principles of the discipline of architecture. Bob Kahn is a storyteller, and we have invited him here this evening to tell the story of James Stirling, one of the most important architects of the second half of the 20th century, but I have to say an architect who today has been largely forgotten. And I'm going to turn it over to Bob, but I would like to mention that if you would like to ask questions, we will answer them at the end. If you could put your question into the chat, and then I will be able to read through them and read them to Bob at the end of the lecture. So I give you Bob Kahn.
Thank you, Robert. You're a good publicist for me. And I want to thank Carmen and Heather, and I also want to, and the committee for inviting me. I appreciate it. Okay, so this, as you can see, this first slide is of Jim Stirling, and this is how I remember him. Okay, I have to see if I can advance my slides here. I don't know why I cannot, but I will. This is already, give me a second here. Technical glitch. I'm old.
You may need to click on the slide and then use your keyboard.
If I can click on it, let's try that. There we go. Thank you. Jim Stirling was my teacher, my employer, and my friend. Fondly known as Big Jim, he was in many ways larger than life, both figuratively and literally. Like his buildings, he was a complex man, serious in the office, but with a wry sense of humor, simultaneously both brash and shy, and undeterred by what people thought of him. I would be delighted to spend the entire hour telling you the true, outrageous stories that were part of who he was. Indeed, he was a character and the bad boy of architecture. But here, I want to mostly concentrate on his buildings, abstractly and on their own terms. Because of time, I will present a brief survey of a few of his buildings, and along the way, do a close reading of a handful of projects that I think are emblematic of his career. Stirling never discussed theory or his thoughts behind designing a building. I believe he didn't have to, as the buildings speak for themselves. It's just a matter of learning how to see. James Fraser Stirling was born in Glasgow on April 22nd, 1925. His father was a ship's engineer and his mother a school teacher. His childhood was spent in Liverpool, and in 1942, he entered the Liverpool School of Art. He left after 1 year to serve in World War II. Following the war, where he parachuted on D-Day as part of the Black Watch, and by the way, he would never tell me if he was wearing a kilt or not, he studied architecture at Liverpool University from 1946 to 1950. After graduation, he moved to London and attended the Town Planning and Research Office School from 1950 to 1952. From 1953 to 1956, he worked at Lyons, Israel, Ellis, and Gray, where he met James Gowan, his first partner. Stirling began teaching at the Architectural Association in London in 1956. From 1966 to 1984, he taught at Yale, where he was Davenport visiting professor. I taught with him that last year, and he got great pleasure out of telling people that I was the reason he quit. Among other awards, he received the Gold Medal of the Royal Institute of British Architects in 1980 and the Pritzker Prize in 1981. He was knighted in 1992 and sadly died shortly after at the age of 66. Even at Liverpool, Stirling's view of modernism was already beginning to be more expansive, in part from the influence of his teacher and friend, Colin Rowe. A former student at Liverpool, Rowe left to study with Rudolf Wittgauer at the Warburg Institute and had newly returned to teach. Rowe saw modernism as a development of, not a replacement for, previous historical achievements. As an example, while he admired Corbusier in his own right, he was also able to connect his work back to the classicism of Palladio and his seminal essay, Mathematics of the Ideal Villa. Through Rowe, Stirling developed diverse tastes in architecture, particularly late 19th century neoclassicism. Additionally, Stirling was seduced by Rowe's interest in mannerism, the idea of setting up a set of formal rules and then contradicting them. This idea became an integral part of Stirling's working method for his entire career. Excuse me. The high period of modern architecture, the 1920s and 30s, was a period that represented certain principles and ideas. But following World War II, long after those utopian ideas had passed, denuded of its ideals and repurposed as corporate branding, the high period of modernism was reduced to a style. And yet, we continue to talk about it as if it still exists. As Claire Zimmerman has stated, Stirling, more so than others, realized a critical difference between the 1920s and the 1950s. Not only was there no going back, but going forward in the wake of cataclysm did not allow for unilateral certainty in social and cultural values formulated after the very different revolution of 1917. As I will argue here, modernism as seen by James Stirling is an idea that spans history, from the ancient to the present day. As Amanda Reeser Lawrence has pointed out in her excellent book, James Stirling, Revisionary Modernism, Stirling understood modernism as a set of principles that transcended association with the contemporary or even the 20th century. They had nothing to do with any stylistic language, modern or remote. As Stirling was fond of saying, there's nothing fundamentally new about modern architecture, by which he meant that modern qualities could be found in buildings throughout all of history. For Stirling, history was just stuff to be mined. Excuse me. Oops, sorry. For Stirling, I have to apologize. I'm trying to scroll something here and I'm not able to do it. For Stirling, history was just stuff to be mined. What mattered was the manipulation and relationship of those elements. Or as Lawrence says, referring to Howard Bloom, a revisioning of history. You have to excuse me 1 second to see if I can scroll something here. Well, I cannot. Is our Jonathan?
Right. Yeah, hey, what's going on?
I'm just trying to be able to scroll through my text and I'm not able to. It just advances the slide. Got any suggestions for an old man?
I do not. It may have been the transfer from to PowerPoint from Keynote.
All right, well, it'll be a shorter lecture. In addition, I would like to show his unique attitude towards history and how it was used to continue the modern project. It was not one of unchallenged acceptance of style, the style modernism had become. It was certainly not postmodernism's sentimental and glib use where elements are simply pasted onto buildings. Think of the faux historicism of Johnson's AT&T or Graves's Portland building. Before going on, I want to make one thing clear. When I say Stirling, I'm also referring to the enormous contribution of his partners. First, James Gowan, who was his partner from 1956 to 1963. Especially, I want to call out Michael Wilford, who was his partner from 1980 to 1993, but more importantly, an influential force in the office with whom Jim worked in the same room, side by side, for 32 years. The first building I'm going to show you is the engineering building for Leicester University, begun in 1959. Leicester was the first of 3 buildings referring to the Red Trilogy, a reference to the use of common English brick. The other 2 being Cambridge and Florey. It would be difficult to overstate the importance of Leicester to the world of architecture in general, and to the career of the 35-year-old James Stirling specifically. The building was shocking for its time, not only for its breaking of the box, but for its historical overtones. About 2/3 of the site is covered by the mostly one-story workshop with its skylights turned 45 degrees to bring in north light. The other 1/3 of the building is made up of 2 towers, each with an auditorium below them. One tower is a 4-story research building, the other is a 6-story administration tower. The latter has a 100-foot water tower necessary to create pressure for the experiments in the hydraulic tank located at the ground level. Now, I will warn you, I have a laser pointer, and the laser pointer and I don't like each other. So we're going to see who's going to win tonight. Hang on 1 second. I forgot to turn it on before. Sorry. I almost have it here. Okay, it doesn't want to turn on for me. Give me one more shot here. Here we go. Okay, Here's my friendly red dot. And as I said, he doesn't like me, but I'm fond of it. So anyway, this is 100, this is the workshops. These are the two towers. Let me see something here. Here, I can do it. These are the two towers. These are the two auditoriums below. And this is a water tower, and the weight of that water tower, the structure is carrying the building below. The building is approached from a ramp. Excuse me, sorry. The structure required to hold the water tower supports the floors below. There are also two stair towers, an elevator tower. All of these sit on a plinth, which is held back from the workshop to create a continuous enclosed passage between the workshop and the towers. The effect is a collection of dependent, discrete volumes which read as one form. The building is approached from a ramp to the podium, where an enclosed glass lobby sits below the larger auditorium. The auditorium acts like a podium. So here's the approach, and this is the auditorium. This is the auditorium, and below the auditorium is the entrance, and part of the auditorium acts as a podium. The glass enclosed circular stair to allow latecomers to arrive. There is a glass enclosed circular stair to allow latecomers to arrive at the back of the theater, and you see it right here. Although I find it funny that if you're a latecomer, everyone gets to see you're a latecomer as you're going up the stair, which I'm guessing was intentional. The circulation lobbies in the towers become smaller to reflect the decrease in the number of users as the building rises. The glass skin tapers as it goes up, articulating the reduction. And you can see that this is a drawing that Michael Wilford did when he was just a part-time employee for Stirling. They had one, it was Michael. And this is the glass tower getting smaller. And the point here is that there's a functional reason for this, but it also, the architecture expresses that function. It's just not made up. Rather than Corbusier, it referenced constructivism. Rather than using the Portland stone of ancient universities or the white rendering of the international style, he would use the common English red brick, which in this case was found in the Victoria building at the center of the campus. The glazing was ordinary patent industrial glass. The materials play a game of reversal. The red brick and the tile are used as sheathing rather than as representing structure. In the smaller tower, the wall's bearing capacity is interrupted by continuous triangular windows. They almost seem as if they are being squeezed out of the building. And you can see those right there. The tile around and under the theaters can only be seen as skin. The base at the workshop at first appears to be load-bearing, but the reveal between it and the glass tells us otherwise. And you can see there's the glass, there's the base, but there's a reveal, so it's impossible for this wall to be holding up that glass. Just in case you missed the point, Stirling makes a service door out of brick, which simultaneously continues the base, is unbroken, and reveals that it's not actually bearing. And you can see that right here. The building is rife with historical references, including English warehouses, Scottish castles, Melnikov's Russian Workers' Club, Wright's Johnson Wax, the Palace of Soviets by the Vesnin brothers, Hawksmoor Christ Church, the Van Nel factory, and on and on. But what is important here is that none of these are cribbed, but rather just stuff, voided of their original meaning and intentionally misread and re-envisioned. As Lawrence says, put more simply, the focus shifts from a search for the object being reconfigured to the act of the reconfiguration itself. She goes on to say, referring to Harold Bloom, Bloom's framework, however, allows us to see the referential gestures at Leicester as forward. Revisioning, in this case, fundamentally alters the way we understand the original and introduces the possibility that the latter version could, in fact, supersede it. To say that another way, we begin to read Leicester not as the originary moment, the stronger version of the idea. Sorry, we begin to read Leicester as the originary moment, the stronger version of the idea. Leicester engaged modernism's canonical works and rewrote them in such a way that modernism itself was forever changed. And finally, the buildings seemed to answer a question that no one even knew was being asked until the answer was upon them. What should post-war modern architecture look like? In the end, the collage of already existing forms revisioned and incorporated into a clear abstract ideas was something Stirling was to be interested in as a strategy going forward for the rest of his life. The next building is the Cambridge University History Faculty Building, begun in 1964. Following Leicester, Stirling was invited and won a limited competition for the new History Faculty Building at Cambridge University. Although identical to the competition design, the building was turned 90 degrees to accommodate the site when, after the competition, the university discovered that only half the site was available due to poor negotiations on their part. The stair tower and elevator signify the main entrance, and they are also a reference to the towers denoting entrances in older Cambridge buildings. There is a split canopy, one an entrance to the library at ground level, and the other for faculty going directly to their offices, contained in the L-shaped tapered building. And here you can see the split canopy. And here again, the larger one is for the library and the smaller one is for the faculty. A staff member stationed at the front desk at the library entrance is able to oversee the entire room, including all the stacks, we're calling a panopticon. So it takes one person to, what's the word I'm looking for? To oversee the entire library. So you sit here and they can see all the stacks and all the people in the main reading room. The library itself is a large partial hexagon, which you can see right there. It is stabilized by the buttresses of the L-shaped building, perhaps referencing the buttresses of King's College Chapel and other buildings on the same campus. So here you see Stirling's buttress, and here we see the buttresses of King's College Chapel. Again, these are the buttresses and at King's College. However, here, Stirling's solid buttress are two thin brick end caps, and it appears that glass is doing all the work. Whereas at King's College, the glass reads as infill between multiple buttresses. And just to point that out, these are the end caps, and it looks as if the glass is what's actually holding this up. Where at King's College, you can see the glass is just infill between the buttresses. In the base of the building, the glass is carrying the brick. This is another reversal where the brick reads as non-barren and the glass is solid, and that you can see in this slide right here. There is reference to the great 19th century reading rooms, for example, the British Library, but equally to the industrial greenhouses as well as Paxton's Crystal Palace. The use of everyday London brick and patent industrial glazing is vernacular and a contrast to the stone used in the older buildings in Cambridge. As Ed Jones points out, given English snobbery about red brick universities, the importing of red brick to Oxford and Cambridge was provocative and not without irony. Some might argue that this is Stirling's way of democratizing the university, while perhaps giving a northerner snub to his less working class southern neighbors. Like Leicester, the building is a compilation of discrete parts that add up to a single building. The L shape contains the offices and seminar rooms. And you can see the L shape right here. The towers contain the vertical circulation and elevator, and they are right here where the arrow's pointing. The wedge shape semi-hexagon contains the library reading room here. The partial hexagon, the book stacks here. And the hood shape contains the research room. One can imagine all these pieces as found volumetric elements amassed together, sitting on a brick and glass base. And here is the hood shape. The building was liked and disliked in equal measures. It had technical difficulties, and along with the other two buildings in the Red Series, Leicester and Florey, resulted in Stirling getting no work in England for 10 years. Although the attempt to build in unfamiliar and bold ways plays a part in those difficulties, they were exacerbated by the poor construction relative to Stirling's details and a complete lack of maintenance, which has led to the speculation that the university wanted to tear them down. Arguably, there was also pronounced class distinction. Fortunately, they are now grade 2 listed and they can't be torn down. The next project, which is one of my favorites and was never built, is a museum in North Rhine-Westphalia, otherwise referred to as Dusseldorf. Dusseldorf is the first of a series of 3 German museum projects, the other 2 being Cologne and Stuttgart. The site was developed during the war. The site was destroyed during the war. Dusseldorf was also the first urban project and demonstrates Stirling's increasing interest in context. Although previous projects were often an assemblage of expressive forms based on function, they nevertheless could be read as a single object, whereas at Dusseldorf, the building is a number of individual pieces distributed across the site, akin to a miniature city. The site itself was difficult. The site itself is difficult, with a number of disparate existing buildings competing for attention. The facades on several streets were retained, with the building infilled behind them. As we shall see, the southwest corner of the old library was maintained, but the side facing the plaza was intentionally eroded. The raised plaza separates the site from traffic, creating a pedestrian scale in the middle of the plaza. And in the middle of the plaza is an entrance which allows the building to establish itself on its own right. So here is the building on the site, my little friend, there we go. This is a pavilion, and these are some of the retained facades, and this shows that the base was raised for pedestrian reasons. In contrast to Stirling's disdain for the oversimplified appearance and overblown scale of the box or slab, the building is composed of 4 distinct elements, each related to a specific function. A square gallery building with an open round court, which is this building here. A round gallery building dedicated to the museum's holding of Paul Klee and Julius Bissier, right here. Another and the freestanding pavilion, which is right here. There we go, right there. Finally, and a circulation element, which is where the arrow is pointing and my mouse is not helping me. There we go. More abstractly, it is a reference to a small gallery that once stood on the site. It shares a similar relationship to its own plaza as the Schlossturm, the remaining tower of an old castle, has to the Bergplatz, and I will show you that. Here is the Schlossturm in its plaza, and here is the pavilion in its plaza. It relates to the pavilion corners of the Land Courts building here, and you can see those corners here, and has associations to the pair of neoclassical gatehouses that mark the entrance to a nearby park. And those gatehouses are here, and here they are photographed. It is on the axis of Mühlenstraße. In this context, we can see that rather than the shape being arbitrary, it connects back to the city while simultaneously presenting itself as an object. Even the twist on the site is specific. It is precisely determined by its relationship to an important street leading to the Bergplatz and the water. So this is the axis on Mühlenstraße. And in this photograph of the model, you can see how it's on axis again. So there's nothing arbitrary about its twist, although it does serve to, in other views, make it read as an object. A new stone wall on the side of the old town wall visually connects the pavilion to the gallery building. At the beginning of the stone wall, there are 2 choices. The right side of the wall begins the mandated pedestrian passage through the site. The public path slips under the raised galleries to a garden in the voided circular space of the gallery building, and then out to Rattingermauer, which would be lined with a restaurant and 2 shops, restoring the historic connection along the old town wall. At no point along this route is there any access to the museum itself. So here you can see this is a pavilion. This is the reconstruction of the old town wall. It passes under the galleries into this garden courtyard, then under the galleries again, and out to these shops and restaurants. And all this is restoring on the line of the old town wall that used to be there. Alternatively, from the pavilion, you can enter from a pair of revolving doors that take you into a curvy glass lean-to. It sits between the pavilion and the museum block. From there, you can access the Kunsthalle via a Doric portico, the lecture hall, and various offices. So here we go. So you walk on this side of the wall into the entrance hall, and then you can go into the Kunsthalle through this Doric column, the theater here, and then some offices, various offices. To enter the galleries, there is a ramp or elevator to the second level of the museum block. They overlook the circular court. You enter the two-floor Clay Bessier collection through a split Tuscan portico. It is possible to overlook the entrance hall from a Gothic bay window off the wrap. So you would come up a ramp or the elevator, and you can look into the open court from these galleries, or you can go here and enter the Clay Bessier gallery, and then this Gothic window overlooks the entry hall. The museum block of the building is set back from the edges of the site. The galleries surround a voided circular space containing a garden, but there is no access from the museum to the circular drum. Although reminiscent of a classical space, i.e. the Pantheon, it is open to the sky and treated like a void, clearing it of associated classical meanings. And you can see the drum here. There is a relationship of the voided circular space and the solid pavilion, as if the latter had been removed from the former. The pavilion, rather than being literally circular, transforms to take its shape in response to site conditions. As noted by Anthony Vidler, Lawrence, and others, the circulation has resonances in Corbusier's Salvation Army building. Both have multiple pavilions, one a circle and the other a square, connected by a passage and ending in an entrance hall. As Lawrence points out, whereas Corbusier's led to an entrance, Stirling passes right through the building. As well, she notes, Stirling's circulation alternates between solid and void, exterior and interior. And here at the Corbusier's building, here's the slab, here's the square pavilion, here's the round pavilion, and they're connected, leading to the entrance. This building is simultaneously deferential and aggressive, respectful and subversive. Like all of Stirling's projects, to one degree or another, historical references are dissociated from their original meaning, repurposed and corrected to specific uses as a way of introducing a new vocabulary into modernism. More importantly, like all Stirling's projects, there is a strong abstract idea embedded into the design. This next project is the Neue Staatsgalerie in Stuttgart, Germany. Following the burst of university work in the 8 years from 1963 to 1971, the office had little work for the next 10 years and no built project since 1969. Nevertheless, Stirling was world-renowned in part due to the publication of the first monograph in 1974. Many of the projects for that volume were redrawn by the young Leon Krier. The office entered the competition for the extension to the Staatsgalerie in Stuttgart. Following the entry, the office let go a number of employees as there was no more work. According to John Toomey, one of those employees, some of them took off for Rome. After an outing to the Villa d'Este, someone decided to check in with the office. Stirling was cross, asking where the hell everyone was. We've won Stuttgart. What are you doing in Rome? They returned immediately. The Neue Staatsgalerie in Stuttgart is the third museum in the German trilogy and the only one of the three to be built. It is considered Stirling's masterpiece, and I believe the last thus far in a long history of canonical buildings. It is clearly derived from Stirling's two previous museum explorations in Dusseldorf and Cologne. Few contemporary buildings have been written about more than this one. Colin Rowe, Anthony Vidler, Kenneth Frampton, Robert Maxwell, and Raphael Monet are among the many that have weighed in. As Frank Werner states, thus his museum, which might seem populistic, in reality consists of a complex architectural collage formed out of such a disconcerting abundance of typologies and iconographical references that whole generations of historians of art and architecture will have to labor over their decipherment. The gallery is, in addition to the Staatsgallery, a neoclassical U-shaped building. It contains a semicircular court drive with a sculptural man on a horse. So this is the U-shape. This is the horse, and here you can see the horse in the old Staatsgallery, which is now referred to here and here. The new building is also U-shaped, and instead of a semicircular drive, there is a circular courtyard. As a wing to the original Staatsgallery, the entrance taxi drop-off pavilion has the same equivalency as the horse statue to the circular drive court in the old building. And it's situated right there, and here you can see the taxi drop-off. The Neue Staatsgallery is bracketed between one wing of the old gallery building and the new theater. So here's the old wing of the gallery building, here's the new theater, and it sits between them. The upper gallery space from the old museum. Following the tradition of the 19th century museum type, this is a sequence of rooms as opposed to open planning. Outside of these galleries are terraces containing sculpture, accessible from the galleries via a glass door. So here are the terraces, here are the enfilade galleries, and I want to point out this drawing that Stirling did. He was obsessed that in any museum he designed, that you never had to backtrack where you had been to see something else. There's a 3-meter raised terrace located between the gallery wings. At this level, in addition to the entrance, there is a temporary exhibition space and lecture hall. Below the plinth is parking. It should be noted that there is a significant level change between the back of the building and the front of the building facing Konrad Adenauer Straße. So this is the 3-meter raised terrace. It's here in the plan. This shows you the big change in the site in terms of its height. This is the temporary gallery, and this is the lecture hall. There are so many possible readings of this building, I would need the entire hour just to list them. I will touch on a few. It is possible to read certain pressure on the site as if the U-shaped galleries were compressed, forcing the 3-meter terrace beyond the galleries. So this is the terrace, and you can see that part of it pokes out beyond the buildings due to the pressure on the terrace space. Simultaneously, the pressure distorts the galleries where they meet the rotunda. And you can see here the rotunda has been pushed in as it came down and put pressure on the gallery. And this is one of my favorite spaces in the museum. It's just like it feels like a medieval street as you walk through it. The administration building at the top of the site can be read as material squeezed out from the compression, and you see it here. I'm going to skip this slide. The circulation is a study of implied access and then denial of a simultaneous formality and informality. A defining element of the museum, like Dusseldorf before, was the mandate to create public access through the site. Here, Stirling accomplishes this by creating a diagonal through the complex. And you can see in this preliminary sketch, the diagonal going through the site. This is accessible at all times, and there is no access to the museum itself, ensuring a public right-of-way through the heart of the building. Beginning at the taxi drop-off, you are on center. Immediately, you are diverted from the axis by the ramp or stair. Continuing along the next ramp, you reach the beginning of the rotunda, where once again you are on axis. The ramp follows the edge of the sculptural court off axis until it reaches the top of the rotunda and is once again recentered, only to be thrown off axis one last time, now centered on the small cog of the bookstore. So in a classical building, you would be on axis all the time. In a modern building, it would be asymmetry, and here it does both. So you enter here on axis to the drum. You come up and around the ramps, up another ramp. Again, you're on axis, immediately thrown off axis by going around the drum, on axis again, and then finally off axis, but now that aligns with the small bookstore round building here. These are the ramps that take you in the public way around the drum, and there's no access to the drum from these ramps. The public entrance to the building begins at Konrad Adenauer Strasse. A ramp or stairs takes you up to the lower terrace where the entrance to the building is located, as well as separate entrances to the cafeteria and the theater. So this is Konrad Adenauer Strasse. This is the beginning. The ramp takes you up and onto that upper terrace, which is here. And then there are additional entrances from that terrace besides the main museum itself. The building is entered under a steel and glass canopy, one of several in the project, each sized to denote importance. And they're entered into a three-dimensional curved entry hall. So this is the glass and steel entry piece. It has 3 bays. Here it is in plan, and this is the entry hall. And you can imagine when this building was built, how difficult it was to draw this three-dimensional curve and how difficult it was to build it. Here are up views of the 3 canopy sizes. The entrance gets 3 bays, the theater 2 bays, and the administration 1. So here are the 3 bays for the main entrance, the 2 bays for the theater, and the 1 bay for the administration building. And what you probably can't see very clearly is the intricacy of these drawings. So these up views, after they were done, Jim liked to come back and color them in. Usually on a Sunday, I was always there after a rather raucous night on Saturday, which I think is how he made it through the next day. There is another revisioning here. The great 6th century Mannerist architect, Giulio Romano, played with keystones at the Palazzo del Te. Stirling's keystones look correct until you realize that it is made up of the same coursing as the rest of the building, and there is no keystone at all. Robert Lizzie notes that the circular window appears to have just rolled along the top of the stone. So here's the Giulio Romano's keystones. They're kind of redundant because it already has a piece of structure over it. Here, Stirling's keystones, but if you look carefully, it's just the coursing going through. There is no actual keystone. And here's the window, which reads very much like it just rolled along and happened to stop in the right place. After entering the library, immediately ahead is a top-lit, object-like circular structure containing the bookstore and reestablishing order to this free space. It can also be read as a smaller cog to the larger cog of the central court. So here is the bookstore. Here it is top lit. But if you look at this drawing, this is the main court. This is the bookstore. And it really does look like a smaller cog engaging a larger cog. Beyond there is a glass elevator and an open armature and a ramp leading to the upper gallery level. So that's the glass elevator. This is the ramp. Here you see the open armature. Here's some early drawings of it. The center rotunda, whose floor is below the entrance level, can only be accessed from stairs up from the temporary gallery space or down from the gallery itself. So from the upper level, you can access the drum by coming down these stairs, or from the temporary gallery, you come up from these stairs. And then you can read these old columns. You can choose to read them as they are being excavated, or you can choose to read them as they're trying to recede back into the building. Robert Lizzie, in his excellent book, Architectural Stuff, states, "There is no one better at subversion than Stirling. He subverts style, the monumental, and symmetry, all for the benefit of absorbing the context and accommodating the program. As a result, the Staatsgallery Gallery is a modern Mannerist masterpiece. For all the calm of the cornice aligning with the old museum, there is an enormous amount of slipping, sliding, bending, and breaking going on. He goes on to discuss and show bracketing, fleeting centers, the conflict between center and edge, and the intentional alignment and misalignment of various elements, including doors, windows, and scuppers. He shows how similar elements are presented in different ways with different meanings. For example, there are 3 types of windows and portals: historical, vernacular, and abstract, all used in different ways for specific purposes. It goes on. He concludes by saying, from day one, Stirling was the bad boy of architecture. At the Staatsgallery, he enhanced his reputation by subverting style, mixing the monumental with play, and absorbing the context. Even the materiality of the Staatsgallery is a stick in the eye. No self-respecting modernist would build in stone, and no self-respecting classicist would expose to steel or be so playful with the stone and glass." So before going on, I want to show you one of my of the many examples of Stirling at play. As this building was nearing completion, the fire department demanded that there be more fresh air in the parking garage. Rather than add grills, Stirling simply punched the stones out of the wall and left the dislodged stones on the ground. Of course, there were carefully executed working drawings for the location of the displaced stones. The dislodged stone is solid, whereas Stirling makes a point of showing throughout the building that the stone is only veneer. I will limit my own analysis to showing how the Stotz Gallery is a revisioning of the other two buildings by architects at Stirling and Meyer. The Altes Museum in Berlin by Carl Friedrich Schinkel, begun in 1823, and the Palace of Assembly in Chandigarh by Le Corbusier, begun in 1951. On the surface, these buildings look nothing alike. The Altes building is composed of 4 elements. A Greek stoa entrance portico, which is this here, and here it is in section. A Baroque U-shaped gallery space. A circular interior space, recollecting the ancient Pantheon, and you can see this is the actual drawing of Schinkel of his space. And a set of freestanding stairs set among the columns. Note the similarity in Stirling's work of combining different historical typologies within one building. These spaces have been highlighted with green representing the entrance piece, pink the stairs, red the rotunda, and blue the galleries. The Palace of Assembly is composed of similar elements, although more abstracted, and can be read as Corbusier's revisioning of the Altes Museum. Like the Altes, the entry piece forms a tall, abstracted stoa. So here's the stoa in the front, here it is here, and here's an elevation of it. The stair in this case ramps is turned 90 degrees and the assembly with it, leaving it off-center and treated as objects within a free plan. So this, as opposed to the Schinkel, he's twisted the whole thing 90 degrees, and these are sitting within the columns as objects. The second level also contains the forum, which is also treated as an object and receives light, like the assembly, through the roof from which they both project. So here's the forum, and you can see it poking up here, and here's the assembly poking up there. These are highlighted with green representing the entrance piece, pink the stairs, red the assembly, blue the offices, and yellow the forum. The Stotz Gallery, the third in the trilogy, is a revisioning of both. Both Colin Rowe and Anthony Vidler have pointed out that the building has no facade, although I disagree. Either way, the building's front is open, and in response, Stirling uses trees to stand in for the loggia. The presence of the trees, 2 rows, from the earliest drawings to the model and the final project, confirms this intent. The central rotunda, unlike both the Altes and the assembly, is now a void rather than being the climax as it is in the other 2 buildings. The stairs and ramps are both axial and off-centered. The object-like round drum of the bookstore, toplit, can be compared to the object-like forum, also toplit in the assembly building. Again, these spaces have been highlighted, with green representing the entrance piece, pink the stairs, red the rotunda, blue the galleries, and yellow the bookstore. What is interesting to me is that all 3 buildings share the same abstract diagram or idea, yet none of them look alike. The idea is independent of context, historical period, program, etc. None of them are copies or simply quotations of the other, but rather, using Harold Bloom's terms, revisions and corrections through intentional misreadings. Schinkel starts as a collage of familiar elements, Baroque palace, Greek stoa, ancient pantheon, remove them from their historical meaning. Corbusier revisions and abstracts the idea. Stirling then revisions the 2 of them using both historical elements as well as modernist and high-tech language, all emptied of their historical meaning, in an effort to extend the modernist project. It is the idea, not the style, that is carried forward from building to building. The next project is the Cornell University Performing Arts Center, begun in 1983. The project began almost immediately after Stirling's residency at the American Academy in Rome. It is here that what was to become his frequent use of the loggia as an organizing element began. The building is located on the edge of town, facing the main campus, which is located on the other side of the gorge. The massing and plan, if not detail, are clearly a play on Italian architecture. There is a campanile elevator tower, a baptistry information kiosk, the outline of two basilicas, theater and studios, and a loggia. The assembly is tightly woven together on the edge of the gorge. And so here's the building. Here, this is the basilica. Sorry, this is the baptistry. These are the basilicas. This is the campanile. And the loggia you can barely make out. In a speech, Stirling related how he had listened to an elderly couple looking at the building. One said to the other, "I think that's some kind of Italian ripoff," which, said Stirling, I take to be some kind of a compliment. The loggia faces the gorge and is the organizational device for the project. At the end of the loggia, on the street side, is the information kiosk, which serves as ticket office and bus stop, and also marks the bridge over the gorge. In front of the studio building, let me see if I can remove our little red friend here. Nope. In front of the studio building is a small urban plaza. The studio building has a large projecting window from the main dance studio overlooking the plaza and the street. The elevator tower references the main feature of Cornell's campus, a clock tower inspired by an Italian campanile, which looks down a long vista to the Performing Arts Center. There is a tremendous amount of program packed into the small site. It is Stirling's signature combination of formal shapes and informal uses. So this is the campus's clock tower. This is Stirling's elevator tower, and they're on either side of the gorge, so it connects this building back to the main campus. As this is the building that I take a little sip here. As this is the building that I spent the most time in the office, I thought I would use it to briefly explain the way projects are developed. My first day in the office, Jim dropped a 3-pound program prepared by the client on my desk. He then asked that I reduce this down to a clip, meaning a couple of pages clipped together, summarizing the massive tome. What is important to note is that the initial focus was on function, no scribbled images or inspirational drawings. Along with Michael Wilford, I tested the arrangement of these program elements on the site in scheme after scheme after scheme. Again, just abstract boxes. These were all done in small sheets, the equivalent of US 8.5 by 11, with either felt tip or pencil. Jim preferred his red Bic pens. At one point, I recall showing him a sketch that worked really well. It was one long bar with 3 boxes behind it, containing various elements of the project. One of these boxes represented phase 2 and contained studio spaces. Although the building was originally designed around the idea of phasing, it was built in total. The bar itself was a building containing program from which the other 3 spaces would be entered. Jim took out a big fat pencil that he usually taught with and drew some slashes on the bar that converted the building into a loggia. He then drew arrows on the boxes, giving them direction, one facing College Street, one neutral, and one the theater facing the gorge. With a few strokes, he turned my functional drawing into a diagram of the final scheme. This was followed by multiple underlays. The drawings remained small. The various pieces were studied in plan and axonometric. The project was refined again and again through drawing after drawing, until at some point Jim was able to develop those forms into functional expressions. Each building was treated as an independent, identifiable structure. The collection of pieces was akin to a small city. The final drawings were deliberately spare, almost scientific, intended to convey the maximum amount of useful information with the minimal drawing necessary in order to present in the clearest way. The axonometric drawings, bird's eye, worm's eye, sectional, and isometric, were preferred because they convey information with no distortion. Perspectives were limited and mostly done for the client. Every drawing I am showing you in this entire presentation was done by hand. Even as computers became more popular, mechanical drawing was avoided as the computer is too lateral for working through of ideas, which we did through the drawings. Okay, I'm going to tell you a couple of stories on this project. First of all, when I flew, I had to go frequently, 2 or 3 times a month, to Ithaca and New York. And on one trip, I had some presentation drawings, and we had been warned that the president of the university didn't like the orange gutter we designed. And I should say the president of the university was an Englishman and not a great fan of Stirling's. So I present the drawing, and the president said, "Well, I don't like that orange gutter." So I held fast and said, "Well, it's important to us. We want to keep it. And we've designed a lot of the building around the color scheme around the building around that orange gutter." At which point he said nothing. So I fly back to London, and Jim calls me in his office, smiling, showing me a telegram from the president of the university asking that I be removed from the project. And Jim immediately sent back another telegram saying, "I am willing to remove Robert Kahn, but if he goes, I go too." On another occasion, I was in flight with presentation drawings, and Jim and Michael were in New York. I arrived in New York, and there was a message for me saying that the president didn't like the glass roof, which was over the glass entrance piece, because he was afraid that the pigeons would mess it up. So Jim's answer to this was to have me draw pigeons all over the presentation drawings. And unfortunately, I can't find the big one, but you can see a couple of pigeons right there. This is not to say that he was a prima donna, but there was some relationship with the client's willingness to build the best possible building and Jim's willingness to participate in their requests. And here are just a couple of images of the theater and of the loggia. The next project is the public library in Latina, Italy. This is an unbuilt project for a public library in Latina, a town created by Mussolini in the 1930s with little history to draw from. The new library was intended to fill the cultural gap. I find this building particularly elegant, a compact assemblage of individual elements. At the garden levels are the children's library, cafeteria, lecture theater, and general hall. And I'm going to go through this quickly. You enter in the loggia, and this is the cafeteria, this is the lecture hall, this is the main hall. From the loggia, which is entered from either end, an entrance hall leads to 2 reading rooms, one a lending library formed as a ziggurat, and the other a reference library with step reading balconies. Formally, one is the opposite of the other. And you can see them here in this model with the roof taken off. And here they are here. And these are the interior skylights, which are partially hiding a very complex system. The glazed roofs over the libraries contain control systems to optimize reading. The ends of the building contain book stacks and have reading rooms that overlook the streets. Once again, which are right here and here. Once again, we see the combination of vernacular, the gabled building, the neoclassical, the 2 cylindrical reading rooms, and the combination of stone, traditional, steel, and glass. I'm just going to show you 3 more slides before the conclusion. So this is a National Gallery extension, which was also not built and lost to Robert Venturi. And I will say nothing about that building. You just go visit it and tell me what you think. And this was important to Stirling because it was in his hometown. I think it was a great loss for him. And here you see Stirling's building is here. This was a competition for an extension to the National Gallery intended to house Northern European and early Renaissance collections. The site is adjacent to the National Gallery on Trafalgar Square, which is defined by the colonnades of Wilkins Building here, and the Baroque portico of St. Martin's in the Field, which you can just see right here. The new building projects forward to complete the composition, echoing some of the elements of the National Gallery by lining through with its plinth and cornice, but like St. Martin's, it stands as an autonomous building. It is a grand pavilion or palazzo with a tympan, cornice, and rooftop rotunda, which echo elements of the existing building. So this rooftop rotunda, this rooftop rotunda. The next project, also not built and also a great disappointment to the office, was the Bibliothèque de France. The library is a group of buildings around a park rising in step terraces from the River Seine. as a monumental but informal grouping which could be a familiar landmark, reviving the neglected eastern end of Paris. Its sculptural forms are intended to establish a mini city. The buildings express a combination of modern and traditional architecture. And there are so many references here that I'm not even going to begin to go through them. And finally, the headquarters for Braun AG in Melzingen, Germany, begun in 1986. This was a departure and perhaps a direction Stirling would have gone on to explore had he lived. This factory for medical plastic products expresses the oscillation between function and historical associations. It recalls the man-made objects in the landscape of Roman Campagna, viaducts, bridges, canals, and embankments. Stirling was a modern mannerist. He achieved satisfaction in breaking the rules, particularly after he had so carefully set them up. He believed that architecture can be an art form, rooted in functionally based expressive forms. It is an architecture that first appeals to the mind and leads back to the building, rather than an architecture of the senses which leads back to the architect's intentions. Not a fan of city planners, he believed that architecture could do a better job. Rather than trying to contain the program into a single box or even free-form structures, leaving shapeless, leftover urban spaces, the buildings were used to regenerate the city. The elements create solids and voids, indoor and outdoor spaces. These are connected through an architectural promenade, creating a unity among the pieces and engaging the user in the city. Using old and new elements from both the distant and recent past was a radical view of modernism, now freed from its utopian dogma. These elements didn't carry their historical DNA, but were revisioned for specific use on each project. Stirling had a deep and profound sense of history, of everything that came before. His love of architecture came from architecture itself, rather than from other disciplines. He was well versed in architecture, in the history of architecture, in both historical, vernacular, and modern. There was no distinction, and all were up for grabs. What tied them together was his understanding that embedded in all architecture with a capital A were and are abstract ideas. They exist from the ancient to the present and can be expressed in a language peculiar to architecture, regardless of where it comes from. It is those abstract ideas that are modern, not what the building looks like. As T.S. Eliot points out in Tradition and the Individual Talent, the artist is responsible to know everything that came before. If he or she is truly gifted, they don't add anything to that body of knowledge, but rather take all of what came before and just slightly shift it. Everything has changed. Most importantly, he had the ability to look, to really look, and therefore to see the secrets buildings hold. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Get my camera back on. Hey. So I would ask if people have questions, if you could put them into the chat. I'll see if I can keep track of them. I wanted to ask a first question because it seems to me that I first became I have to say aware of Stirling after I got out of undergraduate school, because I went to a school where he was not among those that was mentioned. And I ran into some graduates of Cornell, and the first thing they said is that I had to buy the Oeuvre Complète of Le Corbusier and the 1974 Black Book, as they called it, of James Stirling. And maybe if I had the money, I could buy some Alto. But no Frank Lloyd Wright, none of the other things that I had been reared on. But
yeah, that's Cornell.
It seems to me that there's a hinge point that happened somewhere around the time that he writes this rather astonishing essay, kind of taking Le Corbusier to task for the transition from his early work to particularly Maison Jaoul, and this abandonment of what Stirling and many other architects at that point felt was a kind of language that they were attempting to engage and continue. And this is relatively early in his career, if I remember. I can't remember the date of that particular essay. You probably know it, but yeah. I think there is a particular attitude. In fact, it's a bit hostile in that essay, if I recall correctly.
Right.
towards Le Corbusier, as if, Le Corbusier, what do you do? You can't change. You can't change now. We have you figured out. We're following your lead, but now you go off and do this. And, of course, Maison Jaoul was extraordinarily shocking to anyone who was following up to that point. But just in terms of Stirling's general approach, which I do think changed from his early period and say when that article was written about Maison Jaoul and his kind of relationship to his predecessors, his modern predecessors, versus say a much more ludic, playful attitude he had towards Corbusier, as you were referring to, particularly in among some of the museum projects, where he's enjoying something like Champ de Gare, which of course is a long distance from the early Coburg. But so his attitude towards the discipline or the history of the discipline, as well as his predecessors, was also sort of changing over time. And maybe you could speak a little to that.
Yeah, first of all, I wouldn't say that article was very hard on Maison Jaoul. You're correct. It's not that Stirling didn't like the building. He didn't like the fact that that building was handmade. He found it all too personal. So, Corb in that particular building used local craftsmen. It is not very precise. It's a wonderful building. And to give you a good example, Stirling corrected that building in a building he did for Ham Commons, which, if you were to look at it, looks very much like the Maison Jaoul. But the difference here is it is precise, and joints are articulated. In fact, it's sort of a critique of Maison Jaoul. So he used the same language, but he used it in a different way. Yeah, and also, he was a big fan of Corbusier's, but I think when he finally went to go visit him, the buildings, he liked Garches a lot and a couple of other buildings, but he was disappointed in some of them. And I think part of it had to do with that, Corb started to, he started to like buildings that were handmade. They became much more personal and less intellectual from Jim's point of view.
And then contrasting that to, I suppose it's after Corb's death probably that he begins to really engage some of the late work, right? And then after Corb died in '65, that he begins to the Champ de Gare, the connections with Champ de Gare, Stuttgart, of course, is laced through with all this stuff. But
yeah.
Anyway, I know that the first time I read that essay, I was a bit shocked, and then I realized, it's an interesting position for a young architect to be basically sort of publicly calling Corbusier out and say, "Hey, man, you're not consistent."
Exactly. I'll tell you what's unusual about that.
Following the rules.
Yeah. Well, in two ways, because there was a big fight, let's say, between the modernists, at least in England, could not stand expressionistic architecture. They thought it was just, they wouldn't be very happy with a lot of architecture that's being done now. They saw it as being functionally based. So Stirling made expressionistic architecture, but all based on function. So it's not expression first and then a shoehorn to put the program in. It's the program then converted. That's part of it. The other part is Stirling looked at everything. It was vernacular. It was Corbusier. It was the modernists. It was a lot of Liverpool warehouses. Everything was up for grabs, but none of it was associated with any meaning. It was just stuff. It wasn't. If you borrowed from Corbusier, it wasn't borrowing the idea that building represented or that building. It was just something he liked, and he reincorporated as a way of kind of extending the modernist language, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think it's a very different attitude than, Louis Kahn made this famous statement at one point that, if you take Le Corbusier's forms, you're a thief.
Right.
But if you take his idea, which in Kahn's mind is not connected to form, so I think there is a big difference. Then it's a gift to architecture, and you can use it as you wish.
I agree, but I don't think Stirling's were connected to form either. He made form, but it was always the idea. That's the studio we refer to that I teach. If you look, the best example is the Altus Museum and Champ de Gare and Stirling Stuttgart. They contain a version of the same idea or diagram. That could look, as you can see, like anything, but it's the idea that counts, and then the execution of the idea become something else.
Hmm. So I have a question here from Bill Wallace, our local.
I know him well. I'm a big fan.
Our expert
I'm a big fan.
of Michelangelo.
Yeah.
He says Latina, referring to the Latina project.
Yeah.
These beautiful complementary libraries look a bit like those that stood opposite Trajan's column. Is this a deference or reference to history?
I'm sure it is. I can't say what the specific reference is because, you know, as I said, Stirling never talked about where his buildings came from. He never talked about theory. He would present them in the most matter-of-fact way, but it certainly could be. I love that particular library. I'm very sad it never got built. No, I don't know, but I can imagine that it was.
Well, it's interesting because you showed that one image because the library is kind of at the back of the site and there's this other building in the front. So it does have this kind of posture against a singular monument that it's
yeah, it very well could. It very well could have been.
Yeah. From Jonathan Stittleman, did Stirling ever speak of leverance? Leverance was also heavy on practice and inspired by Schinkel.
I never heard him speak of it.
Leverance, yeah.
Oh, Leverance. No, I never heard him. I thought you said Labyrinth. Sorry. No, but I know Leverance. Sorry. Leverance was a better architect than a Labyrinth. But I'd never heard him speak of him. But again, that doesn't mean anything. He had such a broad range of knowledge. And it was never, I mean, it's not, he would give a lecture and I think it could be very funny, but it was never full of any insider information. He never revealed anything.
But I think he was also like a lot like Kahn in that, you know, he was constantly taking photos of stuff and that, you know, he does publish these articles and suddenly has these very bizarre vernacular buildings and factories and whatnot. And Kahn was the same way. He would come back from his trips and he'd have all these slides of, and you say, well, that's sort of a Kahnian looking building, but it's some ancient brewery or something.
Exactly what Stirling did. It would, and he collected them from his youth. A lot of it's like Liverpool warehouses. It could be high or low. And by the way, he was a big fan of Kahn, obviously. Who wouldn't be? But he liked him a lot. I can't say he liked other contemporary architects at this, you know, of Kahn's generation, but he liked him. You know, the funny thing, you mentioned it, it's funny how Kahn was a little bit later, but, you know, Mies, Gropius, Corbusier, and then a little bit later Kahn all died around the same time. It's fascinating. You know, Kahn was 72, I think, right? But the others were late 60s.
Well, you know, Wright was first in 59. Well, first, except that, I mean, if you count people that had a full life, because Saarinen, of course, was his life was cut short. So I have a question from, I'm seeing there's some questions also in the question and answer. It's a little confusing, but John Gunther, who's our local AIA person and a great historian in his own right, he says, please share your thoughts on Stirling's use of color.
He clearly liked color. Not everyone liked the color that he used, but I think, you know, for all the underlying seriousness of the buildings, they were incredibly playful. And particularly so at Stuttgart, those, you know, bright red and I can't remember now, blue or green handrails. He just loved it. I mean, I think it was a way of making the buildings more fun, making them less serious. And he liked it. And it's funny because, and it was also not white architecture. Although if people really look carefully, you'll see that Corbusier used a lot of color. You know, a lot of people did, but you never really see that in the photographs. So I don't know. I think it was just to enliven the buildings and make them more fun.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned that because, of course, Corbusier's color is for the most part inside, except at the Pessac houses and a few other places.
Yeah. The
early work, and he has his own particular set of colors that he, you know, patents and puts into production.
I have them, by the way. You can buy them.
And then as his work moved forward, you know, he did begin to work more with the colors of materials and moved away, I think, from painted colors. And then Stirling is the sort of opposite because he starts off, you know, Leicester, which is such a great building, but I mean, it's the red brick and everything is, I mean, there is paint, but it's painted in a sort of recognizable sort of what you paint steel or what you paint this or that. And then he moves into where color is applied to more and more elements. Usually metal is a favorite. I noticed that, but and then of course he does have the natural stone, but
He had a very limited palette. There was early on there was brick, and then it became stone and glass and steel. But it was, if you look at the projects, it's a pretty consistent palette throughout.
Mm. I had another question because I'm waiting to see if any others come. But I was interested in your comment about how you described Leicester, which I have to say, when that building was published, I do think it had kind of the kind of impact that you would get from, Corb's change of direction. I mean, it flattened a lot of people. It was so amazing, and it made so much sense. But it is a kind of amazing collage, and I think he's taking these volumes of interior, sort of specific interior function, and then he's rendering them as kind of elements that are collaged in a link that somehow is a link in the chain of a kind of disciplinary chain. So he's connecting different times together, at least within sort of early modernism to the time that he's writing, or that he's working. And so I think that it's kind of an alchemy thing. It's just amazing what it at once it's kind of fixed, but then it seems very unstable in a kind of very dynamic way.
If you take one piece away, the whole thing would fall down. That's what it always feels like, right?
Yeah,
like a Jenga,
because the structure is interlaced in a way, as you described it. The water tank is kind of putting a kind of cap on the thing. I have another question from John Knutson. To what extent was Stirling's use of precedence intentional versus intuitive, or is there a distinction?
Well, I'm not sure there's a distinction, but it was pretty intentional. I mean, in the sense that it's a little hard to explain. His use of precedents was never about what they represented. They were just things that he saw. So if it meant something on one building, when he reused it, it wouldn't have that meaning anymore. It would just mean whatever it meant on the building he was doing. But he was quite aware of history. But it wasn't, you don't feel like he sat down. I mean, I can't speak for him, but you don't feel like he sat down and said, oh, I'm going to make a building, I'm going to use this. As the building developed, and as I said, it developed in a very linear, very functional, straightforward way. It would then become more elaborated in terms of form, and then in terms of historical references. I don't know if I answered the question, but I don't know that I can answer the question.
Well, now William Wallace is going to give you a tough one.
All right,
and
I can take it.
It's an impossible question, he says. Be a historian.
But is it that he'll sign all his books that I own?
Well, that if you answer this correctly.
All right.
So, being a historian and answering the impossible question, where does Stirling stand in modern architecture, and where does he stand in history?
That's not an impossible question for me. Except for historians and for some historians and some academics, he has been all but forgotten. This was a man for 30 years, was the most famous architect among architects, not the public, in the world. But for a variety of reasons, one of which I think is that we sadly have gone away from an intellectually based architecture to a more sensuous based architecture where the architect is the artist or the sculptor. But the buildings for me don't contain very deep or very architectural ideas. I think those buildings over time will fade. And I think architects like Stirling, who has a much stronger basis in abstract ideas, will come back to the front. But definitely for a good 30-year, I mean, I think unquestionably he's one of the great architects of the second half of if not the greatest of the second half of the 20th century. I think because of other reasons, fashion, press, there's so much media that wasn't available before. I think he's been passed over, but I don't think it'll stay that way.
Well, that's interesting. There has been a lot of new material on him, new books, sort of upsearch, also because I think they're beginning to dig into his archive, particularly at Yale. I do think his comment, nothing, I believe I quote it correctly, there's nothing new about modernism. or there's nothing new in modernism. I think that can be applied to any particular moment in stylistic moment. Is that architecture can only make progress forward when it establishes its roots and begins to nurture itself, with what's come before. And I have to believe that as a practitioner as well as a historian.
I hope so, but it does get stalled
Yeah.
for long periods of time when people just look for the image of what it looks like instead
That's
of
right.
the ideas.
Yeah, no, I think the way in which you kind of did it in a quick way, but obviously in the office it would take a more serious bit of work. But to deconstruct the way in which he took apart, the Corbusier Chandigarh building and how he took apart the Altus Museum of Schinkel, and then this kind of conceptual rearrangement, but it's a deep understanding of those buildings and really understanding not only how the building works as a building, but also where did the pieces come from? Where did Corb, get the thing that looks like that came from a nuclear power plant? And,
I think from there actually, but yeah.
Yeah. So the point is that there's a deep kind of immersion, whether it's, I don't know that it's always documented, and that's not the way everybody works, that they actually document their own process that way in sketches. Kahn tended to, just because he felt he was very slow, so you actually can follow his digestion because you see little Franco Wright buildings and other things in the margins of the drawings. But I'm not sure that happens. By the time it appears in the drawings that you showed us, it's already been sort of digested and then reconfigured and freed of its original position, so to speak. So
yeah.
So, okay, well, I'm not getting any new bursts of questions, so maybe we've been at it for about an hour and a half.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll just. So everyone that wants AIA, I should put it into the chat box if you haven't. I think most people have done it already, but in case. So Bob, we miss you. We want you to teach your class again. So.
Just come up with a cure for this awful
Yeah, I'm working
pandemic and we'll be fine.
I'm working on it.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
So for everyone that's listening, this is being recorded, and then in a couple of weeks, it will appear on the same listing of lectures with that you were able to do the link to come to the lecture, and then you'll be able to get the recording of it if you'd like to get it. All right, I'm just getting a few more AIA things in there, so I'll just leave it up for a moment. But anyway, I think we can sign off now.
Great.
All right.
Thank
Ciao.
you, everyone. Thank you.